forgive me, I'm going to have to break a promise. And a vow. I'm going to take those very seriously. Can you hear me okay? I promised that, inshallah, today we will have time for Q&A, and I really aim to do so. But it seems that the lecture might be equivalent to yesterday in terms of length, maybe slightly a little bit more. And I do sincerely apologize for that, because in no way, shape, or form, as I noted before, I'm here to learn from you as much as vice versa. But perhaps because of the weight of responsibility that I spoke of yesterday, that I feel that this might be my last word, if you will. And one has to live with the gravitas of that which waits. Salam alaikum. And shalom alaikum to all your siblings. As you know, should know by now, I always start my talks by Musa's prayer, Musa's dua, Arabic, in the Qur'an, when he was about to meet Pharaoh. And he was accompanied by and with his brother Aaron. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم اشرح لي صدري, O Creator, open thy breast, ويسر لي امري, and make our affairs and my affair easy. واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي, and undo the knot in my tongue, because Moses had a knot in his tongue, so that my affairs become easy. And what it is that I have to share and convey with all of you reaches your hearts, your minds, and we may discover, inshallah, different futurities. All, again, gratitude and thanks, of course, people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people Darhoon, people Andre, people CIIS, John, Heather, all those who labored to bring me here, to Hannah, to Zakaria Gale House, and many, many more, to all of you, and those attending perhaps online. One cannot be negligent of the immense indebtedness that I owe all of you. It's beyond calculus, to be honest. Of course, as we said yesterday, and as a reminder to all of us, because this becomes of great relevance to today's talk, I am standing before you as a settler of color of Egyptian or African background. And although I am now located in Egypt, I still bear responsibility as a settler of color insofar as to the island. My life there does not preclude obligations here. And I'm here with you in San Francisco, or what is referred to as San Francisco, on unceded Algonquin, or unceded, Lomi people. And this, again, is not lost or forgotten upon me. What then, again, is become of my responsibilities, the caretakers of this place, and what is due to them. Again, land acknowledgements are not just land acknowledgements, they're about intent, purpose, and action, intent, purpose, and action. And forgive me, this talk is slightly more emotional than I expected it to be. You see, the white Euro-American Christian man, he fears death. To the extent that when he buries himself, when he gets buried, he avoids that his body touches the very earth. White people, the devil, that includes also Black, indigenous, and people of color, because there are many forms and formations of devils. But those who embrace the devil's way of life envelop themselves in container caskets, in coffers, in tombs, in boxes, more expensive than what they have to pay in the brass gold tax that they give to capital, supposedly as a price tag of living life. This is the white man's attempt to shield themselves from ancestral remembrances. They bury themselves in ancient demagogic crypts, sarcophaguses of pharaonic yore that Moses demolished or tried to demolish with the strike of his staff when he drowned Pharaoh and his ilk, the devils, in the red tidal seas that still live to this day. Well, I wouldn't want and will not live with all those lies that the devil promotes. I refuse. I refuse to live by the lies that the devil lives by and crowns himself with. You who call yourselves Americans, English, French, the crusading Christian West, you can't help but feel, yeah, that there's something that you can do for me, that you can do for my people, for my siblings. You think you can save us. That has been your logic for 533 years. And you don't know yet that me and my people have endured your salvations. And I can't and refuse to endure any salvations anymore. Not for a moment of respite yet. And at the cost of the rejection, the cost of the rejection of your worlds, the devil's world, is my martyrdom and death. Know that I relish the honor of that martyrdom, and do not fear death, not as a Muslim. For martyrdom is an honor to me in Islam, from up and on high, to rise and to be unwashed and buried in the very black, brown, and red earthen soil from which I am made. Before Allah blew their sacred breath in me. As for death, we all die. But the question is how, under what circumstances, and what context. It's all about context, and it always will be. And I would rather die, as Emiliano Zapata had noted, on my feet than to live on my knees. Death is a rite and a rite of passage. And there hasn't been a soul that has been born on this very sacred earth that has not laid witness to death. For Muslims, the absence of fear is not because we are obsessed and teach death, but because we actually know and value life and the sacrosanct principles for which we are willing to die in the name of an actual life lived, made worthy of living. I say this because I know that once we turn our backs on the devil's society, this society, we are condemned to die. So bury me as a martyr, without a casket, or as decreed in Islam, my body is to be buried bare, naked, returned as if anything birthed, the way that I was born, so that it may become part of the very clay from which it is made. And let it serve as decomposed new life for trees, for flowers, for lilies and lilacs, for roses, even to serve as the granule of dust for 1,000 Yafa orange trees. Let them bloom and let them blossom. Bury my body to become a weed in all the sweet scent of musk. I only ask that you lay some tobacco and burn some sage in my rise to the spirit world, to join the ancestors, and perhaps offer a prayer. For I would live and die and live and die and live and die 1,000 times for the principles that I believe in. For us and my people to learn and to be allowed and permitted, without permission from the devil, to thrive and no longer just survive. It is a cheap price tag in my book. My recompense will be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is far more worthy than anything that this world can offer me. There are 3 things that a Muslim leaves behind, by the way, when they pass away. علم ينتفع به, knowledge, useful knowledge that is bequeathed to the coming generations. A school, a place of worship, that is the second. A tree that they plant, such that a wayfarer, a traveler may take shades, may gather some dates from a palm tree to feed themselves. That is the second. And third, children that may remember them, family, community, because a person dies twice, when they actually materially died, when their body decays, but also when people forget them. All I am and all what we are is what we do in the name of our names. That is all that we take with us, in good and in bad. And we all have a devil inside us, waiting to unleash. The Qur'an says in Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, 169, and never think of those who have been killed in the cause of Allah as dead. Rather, they are alive with Allah, receiving provision. The beautiful Vine Deloria Jr. once wrote, "Who will find peace with the lands? The future of humankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things. Who will listen to the trees, to the animals, to the birds, to the voices of the places of the land. as the long-forgotten people of the respective continents rise and begin to reclaim their ancient heritage and listen to me, O people of color, for I am speaking primarily to you, they will discover the very meaning of the land of their ancestors. That is when the invaders, the devils of the North American continent, what is referred to as Turtle Island, will finally discover that for this land, God is red. There is no such thing as dismantling the this and that makes me sick when I hear the word, let us dismantle the Zionist entity, the American entity. It's an illusion. I do believe in divesting, though. You think you're going to dismantle the prison, the pharmaceutical, the agrochemical, the school-to-prison, industrial complex? You're living in fantasy. Divestment is the way to speak. Words, language, as I said yesterday, have meaning, substance. In that sense, we put the state, as I said, our daddy, our real daddy, and capital money at a distance. That is what divestment means. We create alternatives. To ensure the permanence of our struggles, we must connect with land, the very subject matter that I chose to prioritize at the beginning, although it was noted at the very end of the lecture's title. Land, as Fanon had noted, is the true capital, the Martinique black man wrote. Fanon, who taught that the ultimate lesson and goal of insurrections is that you do not disorganize a society if you are not determined from the very smart to smash every obstacle encountered in the grandeur and weakness of spontaneity. The antidote to the devil, my siblings, is decolonization. A whitewashed word just as much as intersectionality might win abolition. A lot of other words that we just throw on our bios on Twitter or on Instagram and social media that's supposedly going to be the source of our salvation. And the price tag of the Congo, as I mentioned yesterday, that comes at that expense. But decolonization necessitates building a world where all worlds fit, in the midst of a war in which all wars fit. 1492, as I noted yesterday. And what I mean by decolonization is non-statist, non-authoritarian. Now notice I'm saying non, I'm not saying anti. Anti is a rhetorical move that you put on a t-shirt or a slogan. Non, that means we develop the concepts and practices to define this non-authoritarian world from our own cultures, our own traditions, going back, as opposed to the internalized resentment that we now have with regards to our traditions. Land-based spiritual alternatives and being able to defend them strategically and practically. With arms, yes, if need be. I don't need some international law to enshrine for me the right to self-defense. Decolonization means building alternatives to and abolishing the punitive, president, judicial, and imperialist military industrial complexes and replacing them with transformative justice, not restorative justice. The former addresses the underlying state structure. Kwame Ture, as I noted yesterday, it's about structures. Changing the operator doesn't change anything. And this is what frames abolition. This is what frames indigenous sovereignty. This is what frames black self-determination. Afro-indigenous futurities here. Because I'm concerned with here. The big devil, the big monster. And the ripple effects that that will have globally. Palestine will free itself. We need to focus on here. We are here. Want to go free Palestine? Try, please. I would love to, too. They don't have that capacity. But we are here. So attend to what is here. But decolonization then demands in my world, what I learned from my ancestors and elders, a consistent, constant, unwavering spiritual and practice-based relationship with land, as well as attunement to, yes, harvesting cycles, replenishment cycles, food-based sovereignty and security. It means relearning, as I said yesterday, how to walk the land, not on the land, to be with the land, to allow her to teach us about our petty insignificance, the fact that we are at the bottom of the food chain. We require animals, we require plants, plants require neither animals nor us. And yet we crown ourselves as gods and demigods. We talk about the pyramids of this. So it does mean engaging radical eco-psychological, physiological, permacultural techniques like regionalism, verbal, and horticultural techniques towards cultivating more homeostatic equilibrium. It's about restoring balance. Regenerative agricultures without seeking a return to that romanticized past. There is no going back to 1492. There is no going back to the time of Mohammed. We're only supposed to extract the spiritual, ethical, political commitments that informed our traditions during that time. Decolonization also involves substituting, yes, multinational agrochemical and agricultural biotechnological companies like Monsanto with harvesting practices that are mindful of the land and reciprocal cycles as an alternative to colonial perspectives, civilizational perspectives founded around domination and ecological devastation. Like I said yesterday, it's basic math, simple, but very difficult. We need to learn the land. We need to learn how to grow our own food, sharing, expanding access to that, withdrawing our dependency and reliance on capitalism. We're not trying to smash it. We won't be able to smash it. Good luck with that. We need to build sufficiency. Our medical and pharmaceutical complexes must be replaced with modern and traditional holistic healing practices. That is decolonization. So liberation and decolonial liberation here means reintegrating indigenous land as much as we possibly can, collectively. Gather our resources, pool it, reintegrate it, give it back, given the hundreds of broken treaties. There was a reason it was 40 acres and a mule, yeah? And the 40 acres got rescinded by Mr. White Supremacist, the devil, Andrew Jackson. Heaven forbid that black people had access to the land. Fair to admit, as I noted yesterday, we were Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula on the west coast of Africa. Liberation involves then conceiving of non-statist and non-capitalist, non-authoritarian, non-individualist, non-utilitarian frameworks. That requires also something beyond just the frameworks, that we transform ourselves. We need to be willing to engage in that process, not engaging in some 18 days of the career of trying to change a leader, an operator at the very top without changing ourselves at the same time. Again, changing the way that we eat, we breathe, we walk the land, we sleep, we engage in intimacy, everything. The greater jihad is that. And engaging in black reparations that neither denies indigenous dispossession or subscribes to a capitalist insurance tabulate of dollar-cent figures. And then devalue, redressing the human misery, shackling, and death, which no price tag can be assigned to. Tell me, what is the price tag for those who have died in the Middle Passage? You're looking for a dollar-cent amount from capital? From capital? What are they going to give you? $1 million? $2 million? Each and every single one of us? That's it. That's what we're worth. That was the price tag. That's the way that Canada tries to squash the indigenous problem. Take billions of dollars, $300 billion, $400 billion, for what happened to you in residential schools. But don't you dare bring up the land anymore. So we need to learn how to redream dangerously. But hope, as my elder Gustavo Esteva, who passed away in 2020 from COVID, and he rests in power, had noted, hope requires action. And when you engage in action, then hope flourishes everywhere. Bless you. This man who ascended to the spirit world, Gustavo, taught me, should be teaching us, that we need to substitute our nouns for verbs. Education needs to be transformed into learning. Learning is a verb. We need to stop using nouns. That's the white devil's way of negotiating and engaging with the world. Because if I say, I am here to educate you, that means you're submitting yourselves for me to educate you. I'm not interested in that. But if we're saying that we're here to learn from one another, and that's a different story altogether. Health needs to become healing. How do we heal ourselves from this trauma, from these wounds, intergenerational for 500 years? Over. You know, thistle has to be managed in order to keep it from overtaking other plants. But it also helps to restabilize the very soil for it. Weeds aren't just invasive species, per se, but rather food. They're first responders, actually. They're teachers. Self-making medicines. Plants that we lost our relationship with. I will never forget the first time I tapped maple syrup on Pendanega Mohawk territory from a sacred tree. I'll never forget being taught to give thanks. Any more than I will holding my first axe, chopping my first block of wood from a warm fire, or for a warm fire, excuse me. At a standoff in 2007, the 2007 blockade, referred to as the Copperstone Tract, defending the very territory that I, as a settler, was on, and being allowed to hunt on, as the only settler of color to join the Mohawk and warrior society there. I'll never forget skinning and cleaning my first hunted fish on my Algonquin elders' land. And even, I will never forget, sacrificing a sheep on Eid outside my grandparents' apartment at the age of 13 to commemorate Ibrahim's almost sacrifice of Ismail, the brother of Isaac, cutting a slit at the lamb's jugular because that's the least painful way, and seeing a being go righteous in an instant, feeling its fear and its pain, and I did, still. And that pain and that fear became my own. I could still see that in lamb's eyes, and I only did it once. I will never forget being taught to make use of all its parts, though, by my grandparents, for community. The act of going down the building, of distributing this blessing as a gift from Creator to those who can't afford it, to the destitute and the poor. You see, animals also belonging in the context of Palestinian shepherds can't even feed on what's green. What's green has been acidified by the Zionist entity's highly flammable tree pine needles. Israel plants pine deserts as forests that have destroyed the olive groves of Palestine. And of course, the Jewish National Fund and other Zionist entities have claimed Palestinian-crafted bustans, or home-centered orchards, as if green, miraculous environmental colonies of their own device. But the land, you see, resists. The land knows. It will devise, and it will thrive. The land always remembers more than us. These are the devil colonizers who claim to make the desert bloom, who model themselves upon the European devil's occupation of Turtle Island. Because if you allow an olive grove to actually grow, it will destroy these islands. The devil, the white man, told us that plants don't speak and can't speak. Ha! As Robin Wall Kimmerer writes in Grading Sweetgrass, in the old times our elders had already told us that trees talk to one another. They'd stand in their own council and craft a plan. Your American scientists, though, decided long ago that plants were deaf and mute, locked in isolation without any kind of communication. The possibility of conversation was summarily dismissed. Science that pretends to be rational, completely neutral, a system of knowledge-making, observation, is supposedly independent of the observer. And yet conclusion was drawn that plants cannot communicate because they lack the mechanisms. Look at I don't even know what to call it, insanity, ignorance. Lack the mechanisms that animals use to speak. The potentials for plants, they said, were seen purely through the lens of animal capacity. Until quite recently, no one seriously explored the possibility that plants might speak to one another. But pollen has been carried reliably on the wind for eons, communicated by males to receptive females. To make those very nuts, if the wind can be trusted with that fecund responsibility, why not the messages? And now only has the devil caught up to the fact that there is now compelling evidence that our elders have told us long ago. The Qur'an describes the creation of human beings, 1,445-year book. Describes the creation of human beings in the womb in stages, from the drop of a sperm to a fully formed fetus. The Qur'an even mentions that the uterine lining is similar to soil in which a seed is planted. The verse. And certainly we created humans from an extract of clay, the clay that I will return to, we will all return to, that there is no escape from. Then we placed them as a drop of sperm firmly fixed. Then we made the sperm into a clot of congealed blood. And of that clot we made an embryo. Then we made of that a lump, bones, and clothed, look at the language, and clothed the bones with flesh. Then we developed another creation, so that blessed is God, the best of creators. Yes, subhanAllah. And this is the chapter of Al-Mu'mineen, the chapter of the believers. Not the chapter of Muslims, the chapter of believers, regardless of it. So decolonization then means drawing from inspirational alternatives as the Zapatistas, as the Leviathan, drawing on dangerous dreams put forth by eco-psychological figures, Gregory Bateson, eco-feminist and anarchist philosophers like Aya Heller, Emma Goldman, Gary Schneider, even Ursula Le Guin, the novelist. There are many movements. But then we need to create, embrace, semi-permanent, even permanent, autonomous initiatives that resituate our relationship to land. And there are many examples prevalent since Seattle's 1999 anti-globalization movements. And they manifest themselves as squatters movements, social centers, indigenous collectives, workers' cooperatives, land reoccupation and decolonization movements, alternative media centers, communes, activist media networks, sustainable alternative ways of living, resistance, liberation, thriving, that even precede Seattle. We have the Paris communes, we have the Canton, the anarchists of Catalonia, Mujeres Libres in 1936, up to more recent examples. We live it, possibilities of it every single day. Namupuche indigenous people struggles in Patagonia, Argentina. The Apple teachers uprisings in Oaxaca in 2006. That lasted, in which Oaxaqueños, by the way, took over the entire province of Oaxaca. Radio and television stations, everything, the entire province. Don't tell me 18 days of Tahrir. For 6 months, Oaxaqueños did this. Urban land-based autonomous ways of living that outlived and superseded Tahrir. The skeptical, patronizing perception by liberals, progressives, and of course leftists, and we have to be blunt, we are not all on the same page, and we do not all share the same values. But especially leftists, some of whom are quite prominent, and again, we know their names, is actually, they're suffering from a poverty of imagination, and they say it's impossible to live without the nation state, especially the nation state, let alone capitalism. No, life without modern states is very much possible. One only look to our warriors, the Zapatistas, the rebels of the Latin of the Naxalites in India, whose territory stretches all the way to West Bengal. Many examples. We need to rethink what Nicholas Montgomery argues are practices of growing, because this isn't just about rural territories, this is even within the urban metropolis. This is why the Zapatistas, John Holloway refers to it as an urban Zapatism. But practices of growing, of farming, and eating, they're all politicized, and they're political acts of everyday life that seem natural or unproblematic. Lawns are political. And what are lawns conceived of? They're conceived as archaic residues of devilish European enclosures. Lawn mowing, this is a practice I had to learn to understand in Turtle Island completely, requires a constant regimen of fertilizers, of pesticides, of maintenance. Everything so neurotically and obsessively. My God, heaven forbid that the lawn just gets out of shape. You are fined for it, for God's sake. Everything has to be trimmed, leveled, because heaven forbid we be reminded how far down again the food chain we actually are. Lawns constitute active obstacles to the very creation of community gardens. Permaculture, rewilding, dumpster diving politicizes the very classification of food as waste, and the capitalist processes that result in the disposal of millions of pounds of foods, everything. Look at the extremes in which we live. People dying of mass starvation. That's what we know. It's the world that we accepted and created and accept every single day of our lives. Because we don't act as individuals. And unfortunately, as individuals, we conceive ourselves as weak. But when an individual conceives themselves as a network of relations of power, that becomes something altogether different. I'll get to it. We have so much to learn from indigenous people all over the world if we are to rediscover our indigeneity. And I don't read here indigeneity as a racial or ethnic construct. I actually see it as synonymous with the Islamic concept of the fitra, the nascent way and embodiment in which we came into the world. The original state of Islam, because we're not born in original sin. In Islam, actually, we're born inclined to do good. Yeah, like I said yesterday, to connect with other children, to connect and smell the rose, to walk before we become disciplined, and enact that discipline and governance upon others. So we're born here, unblemished and inclined to be in symbiotic and relational contact with all that is around us. And a Shinabi Métis scholar activist, Melissa Nelson, writes in the original instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future. Our biological and psychological space is a compound world, a commons. We cannot be separated from these places. The bones and the blood of our ancestors have become soil. The soil grows our food. The food nourishes our bodies, and we become one. literally and metaphorically, with our homelands and territories. Okanagan, Jeanette Armstrong writes, the indigeneity she experiences emerges out of a palpable association with the land, gathering its bounties with my grandchildren, she says, and which forms the very basis of my knowledge, of my lived world, of my experience, and therefore my identity, my being, my culture, my livings, as expressed through my own language, the honor of reclaiming what belongs to one. Through the words, as she notes, as she continues to say, through the words which produce the land's images in my mind, in my indigenous language, I reconstruct to be a part of my community on my land, in the land's images and dynamics. That reconstruction includes the physical, the psychological, the philosophical, the spiritual dimensions, and not just strictly the historical, material, or the ethical, political. James Sakij Youngblood Henderson writes, the land is not the ever-present other which supplies us with a sense of an I. Fuck the I say. It is rather a part of our being. It is ourselves. It is not a matter of being close to nature, this whole fantasy of being tree-hugging hippies, holding each other's hands and singing Kumbaya, as if that's going to lead to liberation. But rather, it's as a means to counter the domestication of human labor, fortress capitalism, homostasis, among us as global communities and population. And here I have to, I have to be very strict, if you will, because again, language to me, and please feel free to disagree, and welcome to disagree, but this is a very important point. Decolonization in my world, what I learned from indigenous people, indigenous struggles, is not synonymous with anti-colonialism. It is not synonymous with anti-colonialism. I'm going to say the same part. Decolonization is not synonymous with anti-colonialism. This is Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, basics. Because the problem that I have is people drawing on anti-colonial movements. Of course, we have venerated and revered figures and ancestors from so far as Pan-Africanist movements that I noted yesterday, that spoke in the language of decolonization as fitted their context and their understanding. But there's an adamant refusal, it seems, to engage in indigenous studies and in indigenous scholarship and indigenous contributions, insofar as Turtle Island specifically, as it relates to decolonization versus anti-colonialism. So this is Eve Tuck and Wayne, who I learned from. An anti-colonial stance celebrates the transfer of power to post-colonial subjects. A decolonizing stance seeks to subvert and remake the colonial system. Why do I say this? Because of the question of the goddamn nation state. In the sense, the post-colonial pursuit of resources, particularly from a Marxist-Leninist perspective and even a classical anarchist perspective, I'm going to add, is fundamentally an anthropomorphic model. Because it conceives of land, of water, of animals, of plants as never being able to become so-called post-colonial. They remain objects to be exploited by the empowered post-colonial subject. So the strict pursuit of workers' rights, the love of classical Marxist-Leninist anarchists that I noted, is actually pro-colonial, because they're anchored in anthropomorphic ideas of land as property, that land is and belongs to the so-called United States, the so-called American entity, the crusading settler colonial project that has been here since 1492. And that this land supposedly should be distributed democratically. That's the reductionist class struggle. There are no single issues or causes, though, folks, as my sister Hershawali had long noted, and many others, of course, long ago. The left, if there is a so-called left, of course there isn't. And I'm going to say this very bluntly, again, I think you know at this point, I don't know how to be any other way, needs to shut up and go underground. And I'm really tired of the left announcing everything that they do, little or small, including what they have for breakfast on Twitter. Who cares? So I'm going to say it out loud, also, something else. I don't give a damn about identity politics. I really don't. It makes no difference to me, I swear to God, it makes no difference to me if you're this or that. You can be a Palestinian and a Zionist collaborator, like Mansour Abbas, who's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Zionist entity Knesset, or even Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA. It makes no difference to me how you identify. If you identify even as indigenous, as black, as Muslim, as queer, as whatever, you could be all those things and Zionists. All those things and Zionists, and there are plenty of those nowadays, especially Muslims. What is my project? And now we get into, in a certain sense, the segue of Islamic anarchism. Maybe there might be a particular one, or an extensive one. That's what Now to get to the question of the so-called Anarcha-Islam. So, what's my project? What's my purpose? Why am I? Why did I write the book that I write? Well, as I said yesterday, 14 reading Malcolm. Mine, dare I say, is an attempt at continuing our shining black prince spirit, his vision, his project. But the beauty about this man is that he was not ideologically inclined. The Malcolm before and after prison is not the same as the Malcolm before and after the nation is not the same as the Malcolm before and after Ghana, let alone Saudi Arabia. He was not beholden to ideologies. He was engaged in an endless project of becoming, of metamorphosis, evolution, growth. The most beautiful characteristic that a revolutionary can have, and I recognize this at the age of 45, humility. The capacity to learn. Because that means that you're inherently anti-authoritarian. You know how to listen as opposed to hear somebody else. You know how to transform, to change, to grow. But we don't lead from his example. We only celebrate and mark his birth and his death. May he rest in power. That is my project. What would Malcolm say about Wahhabi Saudi Arabia now that seeks to normalize with the Zionists? What would Malcolm say about his friendship, his beautiful friendship with a queer black man by the name of James Baldwin, poet? What would that transform in terms of his vision of Islam, queer Islam, feminist Islam? That's what I was attuned to from a young age. That's what gravitated me to this man, who I miss every single day of my life. The Qur'an says, we have created you from nations and tribes so that you may get to know one another. Get to know one another, my dear. خَلَقْنَاكُمْ مِنْ شُعُوبٍ وَقَبَائِلِ لِتَعَارَفُوا وَأَحْسَنَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. And the best amongst you are those who vie in search of taqwa. What is taqwa? Piety. What is piety anchored in Islam? Adalah ijtima'iyya, justice. It doesn't matter that you're belief. So, the state, and here's where, as much as I appreciate Marx, and there's much to learn from Marx, I'm not a Marxist. And I would even hesitate, as I noted yesterday, to even call myself an anarchist when Islam is inherently anarchist. Again, these groups of identities, but sure, I'm a set of conjunctive ends, not destructive groups. Okay. But my problem really is with the question of the state. The state is not an abstract entity that exists over and above us, folks. It's not this figuration. Because the state, as our Daddy already taught us how to govern each other vis-a-vis the set of asymmetrical power relationships that exist between us in our everyday encounter. On the street, in the world of the below. When you're going grocery shopping over here, you have the capacity, you have the agency. What the fuck is this raving lunatic saying? Walk away or pretend to listen. You have agency, you have power. There isn't a crystallized form that exists here. I'm not your professor. I'm not God. There's no institutional hierarchy in this moment that beholds us in a relationship with one another, but your generosity insofar as coming to hear what little I have to share and to offer. But there are power distributions and differentials that exist between us. There's power, like I said, right here, right now. Circulating, unabashed, unossified. We are networks of relations of power. What the state does, what this institution does, no disrespect to CIIS, is that it crystallizes this power, it ossifies it. I'm a professor now. I'm going to put my feet on the table. You, a graduate student. You're not worthy of being a colleague yet. You shall pass through a set of dictums through your oral exams and your written exams, and you will write your proposal. And then after that, and after you clear, and maybe after you get the job, but then your direct job, we'll be considered as colleagues, as equals. Learning institution, awesome, crystallizes. And it can only produce that as substance. So I say, in response to that, bring back the Panthers. Bring back their breakfast programs, their free clinics, schools, escuelitas, the Zapatista model. What our warriors in La Condana jungle taught us on January 1st, 1994, when they declared war. You see, principle, and you don't bow down for principle, declared war on the Mexican state. Local capital, the devil's world of the above. That is what they did. But how did they do that? Did they just emerge on the scene? No. They were building in stealth for 10 years in the jungle. 10 years! And when they were ready to appear on their own timetable and schedule, they surfaced. Bring back and spread Tahrir's Lijan Shabiya, the neighborhood councils. We fed each other, we clothed one another. Women were put up with manning checkpoints. Gender boundaries were broken. We had a queer pride march, and I may have reservations on that, but that was Tahrir. And you had the Muslim Brotherhood and the Sadatus and all factions and colors of creeds that you can ever imagine from whatever political spectrum in the world. That was the logic that the Muslim Brotherhood, when it first started, by the way, in 1929, with Hassan al-Banna, had adopted. We don't want to take over the state. Let's build schools. Let's build clinics. You don't have clothes to cover yourself? Take the clothes on my back and I will give it to you. You want to get married? Okay, I will help you get married. That's the logic of care. The encampments that I mentioned yesterday, that are wonderful future youth and septons. We have medical station, we have a library, conversations, like I said yesterday. What connects the Congo, Sudan, Palestine, with indigenous, with this, with that struggle? Can you imagine then how hard, and I'm sure we all do, because we're well engaged in these kinds of experimentations. Because if a couple, you see, if even a couple struggles to stay together, right? Can you imagine what it takes to sustain a community? My God, couples will split up over, the dishes not being washed, over patriarchy, over all this stuff. Two people. Can you imagine what it takes to sustain a community? In a community that's traumatized, let alone people of color. Islam and anarchism. It's so insignificant, to me at this point. Not Islam and anarchism as a book, but what it's called. I really don't care what it's called. I defined it yesterday as anarchistic reading, Islam, and Islamic reading, or anarchism is academic mumbo jumbo. It's play and toy of words. Call it Anarcha-Islam, call it Islamicism or after Islamicism. To me, it is just Islam. To me, it is just Islam. And it's reclamation, which is my right. So we come to this, my understanding of Islam, that I hopefully, in some small measure, and not to compare myself again to the shining black prince, hope that it sees a little bit of his vision, a little bit of the seed that he planted within me, my siblings, as well as my ancestors, to maybe contribute something in this moment in history. The question of sovereignty, siyada, it's referred to in Arabic. Sovereignty for Muslims lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Its manifestation, I will speak of its manifestation on this earth. But let me say from the start, and of course I reject the narrative that a lot of ikhwan, or so-called, when I talk about Islamists, and my problem with that term, or political Islam, etc., refer to as insofar as Islam is the solution. No, Islam is not the solution. It is not certainly the only solution. It is a solution. But it's a solution based on the verse that I just read, a solution amongst many solutions. A solution that has to be bound with other histories, with other peoples, with other spiritualities, to learn from and engage with. And to be very specific, the way that I come up with this interpretation is from working from the inside out. I'm not interested in projecting anarchism onto Islam. That's not my project. My project is working from within the discourse of Islam. We have gender and sexuality studies, projecting meanings of Islam that are not of it. Political science projects meanings of Islam that are not of it, and so on and so forth. No, let me see what Islam has to say on its own terms, its own grounds. How do I do this? And by what right? By the right, the God-given right that nobody can take away from me, that is called ijtihad. It means critical reasoning, specifically anarchic ijtihad, which again is like a playful word, anarchistic form of ijtihad. And of course I extend on that, and I'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow, when I speak about the queer feminist Islam, insofar as what I refer to as a queer Muslim critique, because we have queer color critiques, queer indigenous critiques, queer black critiques, of mainstream queer theory, because queerness originally developed as a critique of all identity politics. Before, again, the devil transformed it into an identity. It's not an identity. And queerophobia is just sexism dressed in drag. It's actually about gender. So Judith Butler, I'm sorry, all due respect to her, took us in a direction that I don't necessarily agree with. But what do I engage in so far as ijtihad? Well, in Islam, generally speaking, we have the Qur'an that all Muslims share, regardless of whether you're from the Nation of Islam, you're an Ismaili, a Sufi, an Ahmadi, a Sunni, a Shiite, or whatever. It doesn't mean that I neglect or ignore the Sunnah, the oral tradition, because Islam is an oral tradition. Both the Qur'an and the prophetic oral tradition. And then, of course, we have the prophetic practice. Sorry, the hadith is the prophetic tradition, and the Sunnah is the prophetic practice. Forgive me. Went to bed at 3 in the morning. Or, sorry, I didn't sleep. I woke up at 3 in the morning, and I continued on with my time. So forgive my lapse. But then the question becomes, and why do I use specifically and focus on the Qur'an? Because that allows me to use it as the barometer against all Islams that exist. I will take from the Shiite and the Sunni and the Sufi and this and that. And they only exist in differential forms from one another because at certain points certain Muslims felt that they were excluded from other discourses. But they are all my Islams to draw on as I see fit from an ethical and political perspective. So this is why I specifically focus on the Qur'an. I'm not a historiographer, although I do engage in that insofar as pointing out examples of Muslim anarchists historically. People have done that. That doesn't interest me. I want to conjure up the theological, spiritual interpretation. I have to speak the language of my people if I want to convince them, let alone people who are not my people, to show them in their Islamophobia that they're incorrect insofar as their understandings of Islam. So you bring me a verse of the Qur'an that says, oh look, God says anybody who's not a Muslim is condemned to death. I will come and show you 1,000 different verses, let alone put that verse into proper context. So you have to be of a certain Arabic speaker, because when you read translations of the Quran, that is not the same as when you read the Quran in Arabic. It is written in Arabic, it was related in Arabic, and scribed. Any other thing is a translation of the Quran. And of course I deploy and engage with the translations that came before me, but I offer my own translations as well, especially when we're talking about a pedantic noun-based language as English. So how can Islam and anarchism bear any resemblance? Well, to me, how can they not? When Islam bears within it non-authoritarian concepts and practices that do resonate with it. Look at the violence that I'm about to do if I haven't wreaked havoc. How dare we speak of Islam and anarchism, let alone any idea of the singular formation, when, again, both are actually dead, because both are non-monolithic or unified systems of belief. Like I said, anarchism has become a religion of its own right, just as many are. Capital is a religion, state is a religion. And the goal of this project from a movement perspective, because this is not a theological project that, again, I rise in the ivory towers of academia, or whatever, again, the nascent seed was laid long ago for was actually to connect as an organizer, because that's what I began as, and then later on as an intellectual, to connect the flames of Tahrir, to Black Lives Matter, to Black Spring, to know the Coda, to I Don't Know More, to Palestine, to all struggles, to construct this decolonial, abolitionist, non-authoritarian and non-capitalist Islam. So that means I have to figure out or see what non-capitalist and non-authoritarian practices exist, concepts exist in the Quran. To suit so-called post-colonial societies as Egypt, that I hail from, as well as settler colonial societies like the US and Canada. Anarcha-Islam, or Islam, or Islamatismo, whatever you want to call it, is then in part founded on the premise that, especially in the wake of post-colonial independence and hence the anti-colonial movements, Muslims and Arabs in particular altered the very meaning of our own language, and let me show you how. To correspond with the devil's definitions, ontologies, terminologies associated with concepts as the nation in capitalist states. There evolved within that period the very concept of siyasa, which literally translates into the art of governance and politics. And we started to see words emerge in Arabic lexicon, like wataniya, which became translated as nationalism and patriotism because we didn't have a language for those words. And qawmiya, which means pan-regionalism, as in pan-Arabism, or even sometimes it's applied to pan-Africanism. And even third world secularist movements, which is my problem with sort of third worldist movements that developed with the Bandung conferences and so on and so forth, that still preserve a Western or Euro-American Christian hegemony while depoliticizing the notion of religion of their art. This is, I think, a major problem with the anti-colonial thinkers and scholars generally speaking. So in so many ways, my reading this Anarcha-Islam represents a heterogeneous and pluralistic series of traditions and discourses. I don't identify as Sunni folks. I never have and I never will. Sheikh al-Jilani, who taught me, and I was sharing this with my older sister, my older sister. There's no escaping. Sorry the trouble that it caused us. I'm telling you. Sheikh al-Jilani, who was my elder, he was over 100 years old. And I could still see his face right now. Short, stubby man, bit of a belly, cute glasses. He was actually from Iran originally, and he lived in the United States. And he taught me that before I learn how to read the Qur'an, I need to learn how to listen to it. And before I memorize it, I need to learn how to understand it. This isn't an easy text. This isn't a joke. I'm interpreting the word of Allah, of God. And also, if I lead myself astray, that's one thing, but if I lead others astray, that's a whole different matter. That, coupled with the fact that I sat in mosques as a young boy, long as I can remember, listening to and engaging in supplications at the end, especially Friday prayers, when all Muslims would gather together in the masjid, engaging in supplications of, oh Allah, save Kashmir, save Bosnia, save Palestine, save Afghanistan from the Soviets. Then I would look around, and either the mosques would be half empty, or that is the delinquent state that my ummah was in, my people were in. And for the longest time, this happened much later, and after Seattle, and with anarchistic movements, in the wake of the anti-war protests, and so on and so forth, I was always being referred to as the anarchist who refuses to call himself an anarchist. That's true, actually. And this is what forced me, in a certain sense, white anarchists, saying to me, what you're saying is illogical, it's incompatible, it is impossible. And so I was determined to figure out or to see from my own eyes away from the inside out, to legitimize and actually prove my existence to the devil. And this was a period, as I noted yesterday, that was very tumultuous for me. Because in so many ways, and especially in the wake of 9/11, I remember exactly where I was. On the second floor of a building referred to as the JDOC, Queen's University, full screens of the bar referred to as the Queen's Pub Plaza, as the two twin towers were being hit. And I screamed at the loudest voice, it is not Muslims, it is not Muslims. But I became fodder, and as I noted yesterday, I abandoned Islam. But the fact is, Islam never abandoned me. In light of the short story, or the cliffhanger I left for all of you yesterday, the Prophet visited me in my dream. You see, in Islam, the devil cannot manifest in the image of the Prophet, not even in a dream. And so to me, that was a sign, that was a wake-up call. And at the time, I was also searching, because again, although I left God, God never left me, and I was minoring in Jewish studies. I was studying the Baqarah, I was learning how to do Midrash, the Old and the New Testament. But in Judaism, I found, again, the seed of Islam, and as I said yesterday, Islam to me is Judaism universal. So that is in brief the short circuit journey. But Anarcha-Islam is an urgent reminder that there is no central authority within Islam. For example, the first thing that a Muslim proclaims or says when they identify as a Muslim is what is referred to as Aqidat al-Tawheed, the covenant of Tawheed. What is Tawheed? It implicitly and explicitly means that the deification of any other besides Allah, besides Creator, is blasphemy. Be it pledging allegiance to a nation state, an authority figure, secular or post-colonial, a flag, the worship of one's tribal allegiances, even my own parents, the longing of even prestige or wealth, and the worship of one's family and children. The Qur'an says, وَمَا الْمَالُ وَالْبَنُونُ إِلَّا زِينَةُ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. And children and wealth are nothing but, they're beautiful. Of course they're beautiful, but they're nothing but ornaments. So when you pledge Tawheed, you don't love your children more than Allah. Your loyalty is to Allah and the principles that they lay forth that you're supposed to live in. That is the extent of Tawheed. Not children, not one's family. That's forbidden. That is referred to as polytheism or shirk. How don't then Islam and anarchism resemble one another? I don't pledge allegiance to nobody, to no secular states, to no American flag, let alone Canadian flag. That is not where my loyalty. And if my loyalty is to belong anywhere, it is the covenant of the caretaking people whose land I very much stand on, who I share the principles with. They believe in a creator too. Many paths to the same creator. Like I said, Islam acknowledges over 300,000 prophets. I was once asked by an Algonquin elder, Nana Majo, within Anishinaabe traditions, was a prophet, and he became a Muslim, this Algonquin elder. Do you think that he is one of them before he completed the sentence? I said, yes. You don't need to convert or revert. If you find that Islam, that this is your path, then I see that there is no reason that it is not in parallel with your Algonquin teachings. But if you see in it something exceptional as your way, then of course, it is yours also to claim. How don't Islam and anarchism resemble one another? You want other non-authoritarian Islamic concepts? Okay. How about the Quranic pluralistic concept of khulafa? Because on earth, we as human beings are considered as khulafa, as visitors, as caretakers, nothing more and nothing less, of this earth, with bearing a certain responsibility, again, for each other and non-human life. Shura, there's a chapter called the chapter of Shura, the chapter of mutual consultation. Ijma' is a concept within the Qur'an, community consensus. Maslah, another concept, public welfare. Most Muslims and non-Muslim movements then tend to neglect the former non-authoritarian commitments. They forget how these concepts that I just named, that I just identified, are actually building blocks or binding principles for an egalitarian, social justice, and horizontalist world of the below. For Muslim governance and non-Muslim forms of egalitarian governance. And of course, in Islam, the Quranic concepts, insofar as, because I mentioned sovereignty is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the concepts on earth, insofar as sovereignty actually lies in the concept of the ummah. And I spoke a little bit about it yesterday, but I'll speak more extensively about it today. All right. But there are two concepts actually, the ummah and duwayla. Duwayla is one we didn't trigger yesterday, but you're hearing it. The ummah and duwayla are often simultaneously mistranslated as the nation, ummah as nation, that's a mistranslation. And you hear it when Abu Ubaidah talks about the ummah in his speeches of the Palestinian resistance. It's mistranslated as nation. On Al Jazeera and so on and so forth. Ummah is something else, as others. And duwayla, usually sometimes pronounced with the dialect Egyptian or otherwise as dawla, even the Assyric accent, so they'll pronounce it as dawla. It's often mistranslated as Islamic State. There is no such thing as an Islamic State because the state is your American white devil's mode of governing or organizing society. The Prophet never established a state. So most Muslim and non-Muslim scholars and movements begin from the historically emergent, albeit non-Quranic framework of the governance. Another term that I'm going to introduce, sorry if I'm causing any confusion. Sometimes you'll hear the word caliphate, Islamic caliphate. But this concept actually arose after the Prophet, peace be upon him, death. And it's a non-binding concept. And the concept of caliphate arises from the concept that I mentioned earlier of khulafa, caretakers. All of us. To most Muslims, and non-Muslim scholars, even Orientalists, the caliphate is supposed to be led by the belief in a singular Khalifa, assuming so. That's not true. And it's often referred to, or Khalifa is often misinterpreted as a political successor, despite the fact that caliphate is not a fundamental part of Islam, like I said. Both the terms caliph and its associated word or framework of caliphate are actually derived, as I noted, from the pluralistic Quranic term that I just referred to, khulafa. You can see this in verse 230 and 165. So again, these are non-binding concepts that developed outside the framework of the Quran and outside the framework and after the Prophet, peace be upon him. Like I said, khulafa is a pluralistic term, not a singular one, so there's no need for a single rule. My Islam also sets itself apart from other interpretations of Islam insofar as the concept of imam, particularly prominent within Shiite traditions. Caliphate is usually a Sunni thing. Insofar as Shiites, they usually go with the term imam, which literally translates, or they translate, as spiritual successor. Okay. But the same modern Muslim and non-Muslim scholars who argue for the need of a singular imam also argue that the ummah is independent of a human ruler. Most scholarship on Muslim governance always affirms that human leaders must be subordinate in one sense or another to the supreme textual imams, which is the Qur'an. So the imam is not a person. The Qur'an, because imam literally means to lead. What is it that leads? It is the Qur'an that leads. Even the person leading prayers, that may shift depending on the consensus of the community. Somebody feels that somebody is unqualified to lead a particular prayer out of the 5 in any given time of the day, then that person does not lead prayer. So it's a matter of consensus, choice, and maslahah. So again, the misconstruing of concepts, unfortunately, because of this idea that a single person needs to lead. So modern Muslims have internalized the misleading and unnecessary Puritan goal of emulating the non-Quranic, the organic, the modern governance, the caliphate model, which emerged, like I said, after the Prophet's departure, without reflection on the revolutionary commitments that existed within a Quranic set of concepts that I mentioned earlier: Tawheed, Khulafa as plural, Shura, Ijma', Maslahah. And this is in an age in which Islam became part of the world of the above. Sadly, this is all these misinterpretations are when Muslims started to subscribe to successive accumulations of tyranny, decadence. We became rulers of the world. We fed into our own ego. We coveted the above. We forgot the below. And so there was a collective abandonment amongst Muslims of the non-authoritarian spirit, the radical grassroots practice of horizontal democratic practices that existed during the time of the Prophet, especially during his life. Muslims transformed Islam into a religion, a faith, a spirituality of the above, abandoning the humility of the downtrodden below. Now I'm going to get into a little bit more specific, and inshallah I'll try and wrap it up by about 6 or 7 pages. We'll get there. Sorry, this is like a little bit of a boring part in terms of concepts, but hopefully you're beginning to see the foundations for this thing that to me is just Muslims and non-Muslims alike often repeatedly say and promote the dehistoricized view that I mentioned earlier, that there's such a thing as an Islamic state. Daesh comes about, ISIS comes about and says, this is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who came out with a PhD from the University of Baghdad. The Islamic State, and he says the Dawla Islamiyya. Well, we'll get to this concept. And an Islamic State existed in pre-modernity. But they're conflating the medieval conceptualization of Dawla with its misinterpretation and mistranslation of the state. For example, because it's not just Daesh or ISIS that does this. Arab nationalists, every Arab state. This is the problem with anticolonialism and post-colonial moment. Uses the word Dawla as a post-colonial term to refer to each individual Arab and predominantly Muslim state. So Dawla has been deployed, as I noted, by movements like ISIS, insofar as Dawla Islamiyya. But the term actually represents a distortion of dawla's intended linguistic and material meaning as it has emerged out of a violent and forceful desire by Arabs and Muslims to develop a discursive correspondence with the devil's way of life, i.e. nation states, globally, regionally, locally, etc. They wanted to come up with a term that is parallel or synonymous with the state. Well, where does Duwayla, what is the concept of Duwayla? Well, in the medieval period, because Duwayla is a Quranic term, there are many Duwaylas within one dawla that loosely resemble the confederacy. And together, they formed an ummah. And this ummah, like I said, included believers, the ummah of believers, of Muslims, non-Muslims, an ummah of believers bound together vis-a-vis spiritual, ethical, political things. Generally speaking, especially during the time of the Prophet. Within pre-colonial Muslim usage, though, sovereignty lies with the ummah, not with the Duwayla. An ummah is a non-territorial concept to denote a community of Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The Palestinian poet Tamim al-Barghouti, whose father is Marwan Barghouti, the famous Palestinian poet, and whose mother, may she rest in power, is Radwa Ashur, the Egyptian novelist. He writes, a dawla by definition, or Duwayla, cannot form an ummah, seeing that the ummah as an idea is the purpose beyond the Duwayla. Not in defining matters of worship, but in defining matters of political identity and relationship with the other. The legitimacy of a dawla in pre-modernity was not gauged by the welfare of a dawla, or that dawla provides to its own inhabitants regardless of whether they are Muslim or regardless of the ideal image of the ummah. Rather, it is measured by both the welfare of its dispossessed inhabitants as well as the welfare of other Muslims and the service of the ideal image, i.e. the ummah. I'll clarify things a little bit. Duwayla actually comes from the root in the Quran, because like I said, it is a Quranic term. From two roots, Zal and Dar. Zal means to go, Dar means to rotate. So it's not based on fixity of borders, structures. But like I said, we didn't have a word for the state that literally means to define territories and geographies. And so we took a word from the Quran that means the opposite of its intended meaning and began to apply it to the concept of and in the context of the state. Let's skip ahead a little. The vision of a decolonized ummah that all Muslims are breastfed on, especially from a decolonial Islamic and anarchistic perspective, corresponds to really what Bert Kemper, as well as Heidi Stark, deploy insofar as the phrase indigenous transnationalism to describe the linkages, the cross-references, the movement of ideas, practices, obligations between indigenous nations, which is what these Duwaylas formed. So there's a monumental difference here between Islah, liberal progressive reform, and Tajdid al-Thawri, revolutionary ways of conceiving of the world in the moment that we're living in. Now, the Ummah that I mentioned, the original Ummah, that was established actually in the second migration of Muslims, because Muslims had to leave Saudi Arabia, or leave Mecca because we were being persecuted and murdered by our own kin, our own families, so that we recant Islam. A father was torturing his daughter by placing hot coal on her chest. Just leave Islam, and I will forgive you. So Muslims engaged in their first migration, first to modern-day Ethiopia under the protection of the Christian king Najas, who later converted on his deathbed to Islam. And they learned how to build a community. And then after that, their second migration to Medina, because the idea is Muhammad, you need to learn to build. Arabs were very prone, so far as the chivalry and so far as the element of honor, as any other community. You insult me, well, let's get into a duel. But they need to learn a different lesson. You need to learn how to establish community, to build with those that are like you and are not like you, and build alternatives on your lands, on other people's lands. And so Muhammad established in his second migration what is referred to as the Medina Charter. And it's stipulated and is founded upon the Quranic injunction that there is no compulsion in religion. And there are numerous verses. Chapter 2 to 51, 7, 56, 7, 74, and I can go on with the list, but I'll leave that for the transcriber. The Quran explicitly describes disbelievers, and this is where I turn to the concept of mu'mineen, because if I'm saying that I'm seeking an ummah, vis-a-vis the Islam that I understand, or believers, okay, well then I need to trace what is the qualification of the believer and the non-believer beyond the identity Muslim, if there are Muslims Zionists, as exists nowadays. Well, amongst other facets, the disbeliever are those who, as the Quran notes, are arrogant, that neglect the rights of the meek, the poor, these are all in quotes, the orphans, women, as those who dabble in hypocrisy, nifaq, gossip, excess and uphold injustice. Those who spread mischief and corrupt the earth. Those are the attributes that are associated with the disbelieving soul, the nafs, or nafs al-ammara. That's the devil that exists in a certain sense inside each and every single one of us. The masculine soul that wants to dominate. Versus the actual ruh, or the spirit, that is considered to be of the gender feminine world. The master's tools, and I'll conclude the non-authoritarian concept, and I'll speak just for 5-6 minutes, bear with me, on a non-capitalist Islam, because I think that that's important to note. The question becomes, since the state is not a neutral entity, well, do people of color, do Muslims, Black, indigenous people not have other forms of governance that far exceed, again, what the white devil, or what the devil has accepted of a way of organizing the world? Audrey Lorde, the late Audrey Lorde, noted that master's tools can never dismantle the master's house, and hence becomes the problem when people think that it can. So I don't believe in a Muslim Marxism for this reason. Capitalism and the nation state need. They may have strategic differences or tactical differences, but their long-term strategic interests are one and the same. They may have short-term animosities, but they're after the same goal. And the question of economy cannot be separated from that of political governance models that Muslim Marxists conveniently tend to ignore. They'll focus on the economy, but they'll forget the element of governance and their overtures to the world of the above. But I, alhamdulillah, not only draw from indigenous anarchists, but also Black anarchist elders of mine. Shati Alston, former Black Liberation Army, part of the Black Liberation Army, and the Panthers, who drove me as indigenous people to look within. Kumpas like William C. Anderson, elders, and other elders like Lorenzo Irvin as well. So we have a crisis, as I noted, of identity. And we need to engage in the greater jihad as Muslims, and that becomes my responsibility. Now, a brief segue, but this is how we arrive in a certain sense to a non-authoritarian Islam, and not just an anti-authoritarian Islam. The anti-capitalist or the non-capitalist is easy for a lot of people, for the majority of people, unless you're Erdogan, the terrorist, that actually thinks that Islam is compatible with capitalism. Well, property in Islam means something altogether different, because the word for property in the Quran is actually mulk, and mulk lillah. Everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My body belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a vessel entrusted to me as a caretaker, as a khalif. I mess it up, I smoke, I get whatever diseases, I'm responsible for it. This is a temporary exchange and a gift that has been given to me for which I am responsible for. And everything on this earth is conceived as that. So it's not ontologically or epistemologically tied to the Protestant Weberian ethic and understanding of property. We have the concept of communal and individual khulafa insofar as establishing communal economies. Because communal caretakers in Islam, communal caretakers in Islam are preferred, individual caretakers are permitted to exist. Islam believes that the construction of healthy communities begins and ends with unique personalities, interests. It recognizes the collective potential is only realized when the singular individual is free. So it's neither the extreme of individualism, of capitalism, nor the despotism of communism. There are three restrictions, and when I refer to a political economy, I'm referring to collectives. There are three restrictions, though, if somebody, an individual, is a caretaker, as a khalif, wants to establish a collective. Because there has to be an equilibrium between the ambitions and the rights and responsibilities of an individual and the critical, ethical, political responsibilities to their community. So the first restriction, just to give you an example, is that they are forbidden from caretaking for natural resources. Natural resources, water, wood, wind, gas, fire, oil, indeed land itself, within itself, belongs to the whole communities and all of its members. So ultimately one is accountable and one cannot reclaim these natural resources. So now we see the age of black gold that the Arabian Peninsula Arabs are so fond of. And this is why they want Gaza, by the way, so they can get the natural gas and oil that exists on the shores and pollute it even more. As if what they haven't done to the poor fishermen isn't enough. Sniping them at what they're allowed, 8, 10 nautical miles? Look at the devil. So everybody has equal shares and rights and access to all these natural resources. Nobody can lay claim to them. Not a monarchic crown, not the House of Saud, not whoever. Not MBZ, not MBS, whatever. Second, if the caretaking of this thing, this piece of land that is to be intended for a particular purpose, that somebody wants to innovate something on it, that others may necessarily have conceived. If the caretaking is done in an ignoble, indignant matter which damages others and the community, then the community intervenes to prevent them from causing further damage. Third, if a segment of society is without shelter, clothing, food, adequate economic opportunity, then societal needs take priority over the whims of an individual. We have the concept of mudaraba and musharaka in Islam, which is interpreted as communally established, anti-monopolistic and anti-oligopolistic external financial dynamics. And of course in Islam we have the forbiddance of interest. Interest is forbidden, it is haram. Now imagine if interest is forbidden, would capitalism even survive? The housing market, the banking system, entire system would crash. This is why Jesus threw the table and the temple. It's an exploitation of the poor, but I'll get to that in a second. And the purpose of Mudaraba and Musharaka is to cultivate and encourage joint collectives amongst existing khulafa, caretakers new and old. It restricts attempts by caretakers to hold unbridled control over small cooperatives for themselves. It obstructs the development, like I said, of monopolies and oligopolies. It allows the creation of diversified, autonomous small collectives for new caretakers. This tactical move not only assists in creating room for new caretakers, but also reduces animosity amongst new and existing caretakers, because everybody has the right to innovate and to participate in whatever kind of collectives and interests suit them. And they have to be guided, these collectives, by ihsan, compassion, and generosity, by and with the goal of justly spreading resources between caretakers and community. So are to minimize israf or waste. Skipping ahead. Mudaraba and Musharaka is guided, and so these collectives are to be guided by the Islamic principle of huquq al-ibadah, the dutiful responsibility to everyone, and huquq Allah, which means the duties and responsibilities to God, are meant to affirm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's intent for the minimization of tabzir or waste, israf, extravagance, in exchange for the promotion of communal solidarity, akhawiyya, and mutual aid or ta'awun, that are centered on abiding by what is ethically and politically good, insofar as the dictum al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy 'anil munkar, warding off injustice and evil. As I noted, and skipping ahead a little bit quicker, of course we have the concept of interest. Riba is prohibited in the strictest, severest terms in the Qur'an. Those who benefit, chapter 59 or verse 59. Those who benefit from interest shall be raised like those who have been driven to madness by the touch of the devil. This is because they say trade is like interest, while God has permitted trade and forbidden interest. Generally speaking, of course, we have forms of Islamic banking, and there are issues that are associated with that. We have the concept of Ramadan. What is the purpose behind Ramadan? It is to heal the plight of the poor, the suffering that they undergo the whole year. To be deprived and to deprive oneself of food, of water, of sex, of intimacy, the luxuries, the pleasures, even the necessities. For a community to get to know one another in the process of fasting Ramadan, we break bread with each other. Nowadays, of course, Ramadan ends by the payment of zakah. Zakah is not a charitable offering. Zakah is actually interpreted as the right of the poor over the rich. Let me say that again, the right of the poor over the rich. And so when you give zakah, you're actually supposed to hold your zakah out so that the poor and the destitute actually see what they're taking. It's not some kind of benevolent charity that we just pass on. Of course, nowadays we walk and we see homeless people and we pretend that we don't see them. But this is the whole idea, that it has to be given face to face so that the community knows its own condition, as opposed to it being mediated by NGOs or third charities or third parties. Of course, the problem is that zakah is considered to be, nowadays, they calculate it at a percent of 2.5%. The idea is calculate the value of all your assets, what you gained during the lunar year, cash, gold, silver, bank accounts, stocks. We wouldn't have stocks if there was forbiddance of interest. Subtract any debts, business expenses, other liabilities, multiply the total wealth. I'm saying how now when the contemporary Muslims deal with it. Right? Multiply the total wealth by 2.5% and calculate the zakat amount. Well, tell me, this zakat, what is this use of an island of halal in an ocean of haram? If the entire system is messed up, what is this zakat supposed to do? How is it supposed to do? We have other concepts of Islamic banking and so on and so forth that I developed as part of this non-capitalist system. In concluding, and this is for real conclusion, this is how I justify my existence. This is how I read Islam. This is how I understand myself. But I'm a Muslim amongst, again, an ocean, swimming against the currents. And I need you all, my siblings in unity, from your own cultures and traditions, to figure out also your non-authoritarian and non-capitalist practices, be it from Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever it is that it may be. I can only do this insofar as all of you. Islam is a communal religion. Any faith, any spirituality is communal. So without you all, this all cannot be done. So I look forward to learning from you and your traditions, as well as you learning hopefully inshallah tomorrow. And the last words that I have to say in this lecture, I really want to dedicate this lecture, not only to everybody that I expressed gratitude for at the beginning, but I want to particularly dedicate this specific lecture to our very mother, the earth, the land, the Panjir desert from which I arrived from, which I hail, the jungles of Chiapas, kind people of Chiapas, who hosted me, offered me hospitality, that I'm speaking of tomorrow, kindness, generosity, when I couldn't even speak a word of Spanish, let alone whatsoever, any of the languages. And I remember my siblings saying, well, you speak actually more than you can imagine. Language is not really, or verbal language is not the only form of language. I dedicated to the rice fields of the Kalinga people in the Philippines, who again I had the honor of living. The Igorot mountains of Sagaba, the Igorot people. I dedicated this to our mother, the land. Its ravines, its rivers, its lakes, its streams, its very rainbows that become the oceans. I dedicated to the very war between earth and cloudy sky, this rain that is a cleanse and a blessing. Inshallah, may it be. I dedicate this talk really to all the mothers, not just our mother, but all the mothers who were, who are, who aren't. To my mother, alhamdulillah, who continues to live. To Hannah's mother, whose memory is a blessing. I dedicated this to all our mothers who gave birth to all of us. I dedicated it to Palestinian children who come from our street. Children like 6-year-old Palestinian Walid al-Fayoum, who on October 14th, 2023, was killed after he was stabbed 26 times. 26 times. In his home in Plainfield Township, Illinois, by a white landlord who became overnight devil because of the events of October 7th. A landlord who used to play with Wadi'a and made him even swing. I dedicated this to Hind Rajab, who I noted yesterday, a 5-year-old murdered also by devils, referred to as the IOF. On January 29, 2024, after being fired at, as I noted yesterday, by 335 rounds in a car in which she sought refuge in. To all the mothers, to all the children of Black, of indigenous, of people of color, we are the very salt of the earth. We are nothing without you. But honestly, in this moment, I would also be very remiss if I neglected someone else too. And I'm very deeply honored that she's here today. At this stage and moment in my life, I'd like to also very much dedicate this lecture to my kumpa and my sister, Linda Hibitz, whose medicinal book, Palestine 1492, has finally allowed me to begin to heal. So thank you very much. God bless you and thank you.